And I think there's so many great guitar players out there, that
George Harrison's journey through the Beatles is often remembered through a soft lens. The quiet one, the spiritual one, the gentle presence behind some of the most influential music ever made. But beneath that peaceful exterior lived a far more complex story, one shaped by admiration, creative longing, and emotional restraint. George's life inside the Beatles was marked by deep devotion to music, yet also by feelings of invisibility and exclusion. His evolution from shy teenage guitarist to an artist of profound inner depth reveals a man who endured more than the world ever realized. This summary explores his path, his struggles, his growth, and the peace he eventually found. Early admiration and the first steps into music. George Harrison's first steps into the world of music and into the orbit of Paul McCartney and John Lennon were shaped by youthful curiosity and quiet determination. As a young teenager riding buses across Liverpool, he found himself fascinated by Paul's early confidence and Lennon's unpredictable magnetism. These weren't just older boys playing music. To George, they represented a world he longed to be part of, a world fueled by American rock and roll, guitars slung casually over shoulders, and the restless creativity of adolescence. When Paul introduced him to John and arranged for him to audition for the Quarrymen, George walked into that moment with both fear and excitement. His shy but skillful playing surprised Lennon enough to earn him a place, even though the group was already forming around the formidable bond between John and Paul. Still, George didn't focus on the imbalance. At that age, he was too captivated by the thrill of belonging, too grateful for the chance to stand beside musicians he admired. He watched them carefully, not to compete, but to learn, to understand the craft of songwriting and performance through observation. Those early friendships filled him with hope and wonder, even if hints of inequality were quietly taking root. Beneath the surface, George believed fully in the power of music, trusting that patience, dedication, and heart would eventually shape his role within the trio. In many ways, these beginnings defined him: humble, eager, quietly absorbing everything around him, even as he stepped into a world not entirely built for him. The quiet Beatle and his growing isolation. As the Beatles' fame erupted globally, George Harrison became known as the Quiet Beatle, a label that sounded charming to fans but carried personal complexities that shaped his inner world. His silence wasn't a gimmick or a personality flaw. It was a way of navigating the overwhelming noise of superstardom and the intense creative energies of John and Paul. On stage and in interviews, George often stepped back, allowing the more outspoken personalities to take the spotlight. This made him appear serene and reserved. But underneath that calm exterior, he was managing emotions that rarely had space to surface. Inside the studio, he began noticing how decisions were made faster than he could voice his thoughts, how conversations moved without him, and how musical ideas he cared about were sometimes acknowledged politely but not embraced. This gradual sense of being overlooked, even unintentionally, created an emotional distance he didn't quite know how to confront. George wasn't someone who expressed frustration loudly. Instead, he quietly absorbed the feeling of being both central to the world's biggest band and simultaneously peripheral within it. Yet he never lost his focus. He continued showing up with patience, hoping that one day his contributions would receive the same weight as those of his bandmates. This mixture of loyalty, restraint, and inner longing defined George's role during the height of Beatlemaniac, revealing a man who carried the weight of expectations with dignity, even when he felt unseen. Struggles against the Lennon-McCartney partnership. Inside the recording studio, the dominance of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership felt unshakable. To the rest of the world, their creative union was legendary. Two geniuses writing side by side, shaping the future of popular music. But for George, this celebrated partnership could sometimes feel like a closed door. He deeply respected John and Paul's talents, yet he couldn't ignore how their bond overshadowed his own creative growth. Songs he poured his heart into often faced hurdles, not because the band rejected him as a person, but because the structure of the group had been built around John and Paul long before George's songwriting voice fully developed. Paul's firm musical direction and John's intense artistic presence filled so much of the space that George's ideas often struggled to breathe. He worked quietly, experimenting with chords, exploring new influences, and crafting lyrics that reflected his evolving worldview. Still, the reality of fighting for even one song per album slowly wore away at his confidence. George wasn't confrontational by nature, so instead of arguing, he held his frustration inside, hoping something might shift if he simply kept doing the work. His struggles reflected not just artistic tension, but an emotional tug-of-war between admiration, self-doubt, and the desire to be truly heard. Through it all, George stayed committed, determined to grow despite the towering partnership that often left him in the background. Emergence as a songwriter and the first signs of tension. By the mid-1960s, George Harrison began stepping forward creatively with songs that revealed growing depth and maturity. Tracks such as If I Needed Someone, Think for Yourself, and Taxman showcased not just musical skill but a newfound boldness in his writing. Yet behind each finished song lay a difficult journey. George had to bring his ideas into a room where skepticism was common and where the hierarchy of the Lennon-McCartney era still shaped every decision. Even with the Beatles achieving historic success, George felt the imbalance intensify rather than ease. The greater the band's fame, the more entrenched the creative structure became. He often composed alone, late into the night, refining ideas in quiet corners while John and Paul collaborated effortlessly beside him. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Still, George stayed gracious. He rarely pushed aggressively for space or demanded more credit. Instead, he relied on patience and the quiet conviction that his music had value. But the emotional strain accumulated slowly, woven into long hours in the studio, moments of dismissal, and the silent realization that his artistic ceiling was not based on ability, but on long-standing dynamics. Even so, George's persistence revealed his inner strength. He continued shaping his identity as a songwriter, proving to himself, and eventually the world, that a quiet voice could still create powerful music, discovering spirituality and a new inner path. As fame intensified and creative frustrations grew heavier, George Harrison found solace in a path that reshaped his entire outlook on life: Indian music, philosophy, and spirituality. His meeting with Ravi Shankar opened a door to a world where music wasn't judged or negotiated. It simply existed as an expression of devotion and inner truth. Meditation, Eastern teachings, and traditional Indian sounds provided the peace he struggled to find within the fast-paced, competitive environment of the Beatles. His bandmates didn't always understand the depth of this shift. Some playfully teased his newfound interests, not realizing that for George, these practices were not a passing curiosity, but a lifeline. Spirituality allowed him to breathe again, to step outside the noise and reconnect with who he truly was. It reminded him that personal growth mattered more than chart positions or creative battles. His studies encouraged compassion, patience, and clarity, qualities he already possessed but now strengthened intentionally. This inner transformation prepared him for the emotional challenges ahead. As the Beatles moved deeper into complicated dynamics, George's spiritual practices gave him grounding, helping him cope with pressures that might otherwise have overwhelmed him. It wasn't just a phase, it was the beginning of a lifelong journey toward peace, meaning, and self-understanding. The Beatles, shifting dynamics and growing discord. As the Beatles moved into the later stages of their career, the atmosphere within the band changed in ways that deeply affected George. The energy that once fueled their creativity, friendship, excitement, shared ambition, began to shift under the weight of differing visions. Paul increasingly stepped into a guiding role in the studio, bringing precision and detail-oriented leadership to the music. John, meanwhile, explored new artistic directions and personal relationships that often pulled him away from the group's earlier collaborative spirit. George found himself caught in the middle, feeling the imbalance more sharply than before. His spiritual growth made him more attuned to subtle tensions, and he sensed how the competitive environment sometimes overshadowed creativity. Though he contributed memorable parts to influential albums like Set Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, he felt his ideas were often secondary, acknowledged politely but rarely embraced with enthusiasm. The warmth that once defined their bond gradually cooled into polite professionalism, and moments of closeness became increasingly rare. Despite the world seeing the Beatles at their artistic peak, behind closed doors, the unity that defined their early years was fading. George remained committed to the music, but internally, he began to feel constrained, aware that his desire for growth no longer aligned cleanly with the band's internal rhythm. This quiet discord marked the beginning of an emotional separation he could no longer ignore. The White Album, a turning point in silence and resentment. The making of the White Album marked one of the most emotionally charged periods of George Harrison's time with the Beatles. The sessions were often fragmented, with members working separately or drifting in and out at different times. Lennon's partnership with Yoko Ono brought new artistic dynamics into the studio, while Paul's focus on tight arrangements and perfection increased the pressure. In the midst of all this, George struggled more than ever to have his voice heard. His songwriting had developed significantly, and he brought emotionally rich material to the table, yet the reactions remained muted. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, a song born from his inner conflict, became his attempt to highlight the disconnection he felt not just artistically but personally. Although the track eventually became iconic, the journey to get it recorded left him drained. The atmosphere was tense, and the camaraderie that once made the studio feel like home now felt distant. George wasn't someone who exploded in anger, but the quiet frustration he had carried for years was beginning to solidify into resolve. He sensed that something needed to change, not just in the band, but within himself. The White Album sessions marked the point where his silence no longer felt protective, it felt constricting. The Let It Be sessions, and George's quiet breaking point. By the time the Let It Be sessions began, the fractures within the Beatles were visible to anyone paying attention. The project intended to capture the band writing together in real time, but instead, it revealed how emotionally exhausted they all were. George felt the strain acutely. The constant push and pull between personalities left little space for the gentle, reflective approach he naturally favored. When a moment of tension arose during rehearsal, George voiced his frustration calmly but clearly, a rare expression of the pressure he had carried for so long. His words weren't angry, but they held the weight of years feeling unheard. Shortly afterward, he stepped away from the band temporarily, needing space to breathe and reflect. His absence was not dramatic. It was simply honest. This pause emphasized how deeply the dynamic had shifted and how much emotional labor George had performed silently in the background. When he returned, he brought beautiful music with him, but the underlying wounds did not disappear. It became evident that the Beatles could no longer function as the unified group they once were. George cared deeply for his bandmates, yet he finally recognized that caring wasn't enough to mend the fractures. What he needed most was peace. Something the sessions made painfully clear was no longer possible within the familiar walls of the past. The final days of the Beatles and muted heartache. When the Beatles finally dissolved, the world focused almost immediately on the loudest parts of the story. The disagreements between John and Paul, the headlines, the shifting alliances. George Harrison, however, moved through those final days in a much different emotional register. For him, the breakup brought a blend of sadness, quiet disappointment, and a surprising sense of relief. He had spent years navigating a creative landscape where he was both essential and overlooked, a paradox that shaped his growth but also taxed his spirit. The end of the band meant letting go of something historically monumental, but it also meant stepping out of a structure where his voice rarely carried full weight. Instead of engaging in public arguments or creating rival narratives, George did what he had always done. He turned inward and translated his emotions through music. The feelings he had accumulated over the Beatles' years, admiration, affection, frustration, and unspoken longing, finally had space to breathe. He could explore them without compromise. Though he honored the friendship and artistic history that shaped his youth, George recognized that continuing under the growing weight of unspoken tensions would only deepen old hurts. Moving forward quietly wasn't avoidance. It was his way of preserving the good memories while protecting the growth he had worked so hard to achieve. In stepping away with dignity, George revealed the same quiet strength that had defined him from the very beginning, processing the Beatles' legal and emotional aftermath. The years following the Beatles' separation brought a series of legal entanglements. business negotiations, and personal complexities that tested each former member in different ways. For George, these challenges came with emotional weight. After all, they weren't just dealing with contracts and finances, but unraveling relationships that had defined their entire adult lives. Yet George approached this period with the same mixture of honesty and calm that had shaped his personality. While he occasionally voiced frustration through candid remarks or sharp lyrics, he rarely allowed bitterness to dominate his actions. Instead, he tried to maintain balance, even when disagreements grew heated or old wounds resurfaced. This era showed how much he valued integrity. He wanted things resolved fairly, but not at the cost of his own peace. The blending of business and friendship had always been complicated for the Beatles, and George often reflected on how easily good intentions could become tangled when money and legacy entered the picture. Although some emotional scars never fully healed, he learned to accept that not every rift needed to be mended perfectly. What mattered more was moving forward with purpose and clarity. By choosing not to dwell on conflict, he protected his spiritual well-being and kept his priorities centered on meaningful work, family, and inner growth. Through it all, George demonstrated a remarkable ability to acknowledge the past without allowing it to define his future. George and John, a bond transformed by time. George Harrison's relationship with John Lennon shifted dramatically over the years, evolving from the dynamic of admiring younger protege and charismatic older leader into something more complicated. In their early days, George looked up to John with genuine affection. John's boldness, humor, and creative force helped shape George's musical beginnings, and their bond carried the warmth of shared youth. But as the years passed and both men grew into their own identities, their paths diverged. George's spiritual awakening led him into a world of meditation and Eastern philosophy that John didn't always relate to, and sometimes even misunderstood. Miscommunications and emotional distance naturally developed. Yet beneath the shifts and the occasional disagreements, a foundation of deep familiarity remained. When John's life was tragically cut short, George reacted in the way that felt most authentic to him, through music. His tribute was tender, honest, and layered with unspoken feelings: love, respect, grief, and the ache of unresolved conversations. In later years, George spoke more openly about John, acknowledging his brilliance, his flaws, and the complexity of their shared history. He didn't romanticize their relationship, but he honored it. Through reflection, George recognized that, even with distance and differences, John had been a profound influence, almost like an older brother whose presence shaped him long after the closeness of youth faded. A life of tranquility at Friar Park. By the 1990s, George Harrison found the peace he had spent much of his life quietly searching for at Friar Park, the whimsical and sprawling estate he had lovingly restored. The property offered him something fame never could: stillness. Surrounded by gardens he personally tended, lakes he enjoyed walking around, and hidden paths that felt like portals into another world, George built a rhythm centered on tranquility and creativity. Gardening became one of his greatest joys, not merely a hobby, but a spiritual practice that grounded him in the simplicity and beauty of nature. Within the walls of Friar Park, he could live without expectation or performance, free from the pressures that had once shaped his every move. His family played a central role during this period, offering companionship and love that enriched his sense of home. Music remained important, but he approached it on his own terms, recording when inspiration came naturally rather than out of obligation. This quiet phase of his life reflected the culmination of his spiritual evolution. He no longer needed the spotlight or validation from the world. What mattered was harmony within himself. Friar Park wasn't just a residence. It was the sanctuary he had longed for during years of chaos, conflict, and creative constraint. Here, he finally found the freedom to breathe deeply. The Beatles anthology and old patterns resurfacing. When the Beatles reunited in the mid-1990s to work on the anthology project, the world saw it as a long-awaited moment of harmony and nostalgia. But inside the studio, old dynamics resurfaced almost instantly, especially between George and Paul. Despite the goodwill they brought to the project, Paul naturally slipped into his familiar leadership style, shaping arrangements and guiding decisions with the confidence he had always carried. For George, This rekindled feelings he thought he had outgrown. Though their exchanges remained polite and professional, subtle traces of irritation, unspoken tension, and old memories hovered just beneath the surface. Yet unlike their younger years, George handled the experience with humor and maturity. He no longer felt the need to compete or push for validation. Instead, he participated with clear boundaries, focusing on honoring the legacy without sacrificing his peace. The project gave him a chance to reflect on the Beatles' impact, not just as musicians, but as people who had navigated an intense, complicated journey together. The anthology became both a reunion and a quiet recognition of how deeply their early roles had shaped them. Through it all, George remained grounded, aware that the past could be acknowledged without controlling the present. It was a moment of reconnection layered with history, affection, and a realistic acceptance of who they all had become, facing illness with spiritual strength. When George Harrison faced serious illness later in life, he approached it with the same quiet courage and spiritual commitment that had guided him for decades. Instead of resisting or collapsing under fear, he turned inward, relying on meditation, prayer, and the teachings that had shaped his worldview since the 1960s. Surrounded by the steady support of his family, George found strength not in denial, but in acceptance. A deep understanding that life's impermanence was not something to dread, but something to honor. His illness was difficult, yet he faced it with remarkable clarity and gentleness. Those close to him noted how he continued to appreciate small, peaceful moments, expressing gratitude even when his physical health faltered. The grace he showed during this period reflected the depth of his spiritual evolution. He had spent so much of his life seeking inner peace, and in his final years that peace became a source of profound resilience. George focused on staying connected to love, stillness, and the inner truths he had cultivated. Even as his body weakened, his sense of purpose remained unwavering. His final chapter was not defined by illness, but by strength, quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in the faith and perspective he had nurtured throughout his life. George Harrison's legacy of heart and humanity. George Harrison's legacy reaches far beyond the music he created. His life tells the story of a man who learned to navigate fame, emotional challenges, and spiritual discovery with remarkable grace. Through years of feeling overshadowed, he developed a quiet resilience that shaped his identity as both an artist and a human being. His journey shows how strength can take the form of patience, how creativity can flourish even in limited spaces, and how inner peace can become a guiding force through life's most difficult moments. George's message, spoken through his music, his actions, and his final words, remains a testament to compassion and understanding. He demonstrated that true fulfillment comes from authenticity, not applause. In embracing spirituality, he found a path that helped him transform pain into clarity. His life continues to inspire countless people seeking meaning beyond noise. George Harrison, in his gentle way, proved that a quiet soul can leave the most lasting echo,